We should be one
Yeah,
of the wealthiest countries in the world, pardon
absolutely.
me.
And,
Okay. And we've screwed it up. Okay. And so for 2 decades, we put in uh, a group of individuals that basically ignored private sector, ignored what our God-given endowment, our competitive advantage was. And I think the rest of the world saw the decline in our standard of living because of the misguided policies. Okay, so
yeah,
so where we are right now is we should be. You asked me about Canada. We should be the wealthiest country in the
yeah.
world, one of the wealthiest. And here's the other thing: we talk about AI. We should be building AI left, right, and center all over the place. What are you go look at what's happening in the Middle East. What are they doing? They're building all of these AI server farms, the AI industry. Well, we have cheap resources, we have cheap energy, and we have a cold climate, and we are within shouting distance of the largest market in the world. Can we get our head out of the sand and realize the opportunity that
One of the
stands
things
in
I've been
front of us?
saying for years is I'm in a business where the results count. That's all that counts. They may be good looking, they may be charming. Who cares? This isn't politics. This is something with your money. Well, James Thorne, chief strategist for Wellington Altus, has had a fabulous track record. I want to put a capital F on that. And I'll just recall, if you've been at the Outlook conference, one of the things I remember is Jim over 2 years ago telling us, well, you got to get that Bitcoin. You got to have that Bitcoin. You've got to have exposure in the US. You have to have exposure to US tech. You've got to look at AI. All of those things, well, they've come to fruition. That's why I'm so interested to hear what he's got to say today. Jim, thanks for taking the time.
Nice to see you again, Michael. Thank you for the very gracious introduction.
Well, it's earned. Bottom line, it's earned. And I want to talk about something. I got to throw something right out of the left field to you right away, because you and I had been talking about gold and happily being on board in the gold, freight train. I want to talk about the junior golds and get your perspective on that side of the market.
Oh, I think we're setting ourselves up for a renaissance. Uh, you know, uh, Given the fiscal situation globally, central banks are buying gold. Given the fact that the Biden administration weaponized the U.S. dollar,
Yeah.
given the fact that you've got the BRICS meeting in Brazil and wanting to get away from the U.S. dollar, gold is the place to be. And once we get our sea legs in the fact that gold is going to go much higher, what's going to happen is capital is going to slowly start to trickle down to the junior area. And it's this cycle is no different than the last cycle, Michael. So I'm very constructive on gold. I'm very constructive on the miners. Sure, if we trade here sideways for a couple of months, fine. But the pain trades due north, and what we try to say is let's make some money for our clients and recognize the fact that gold is the place to be, and so you better have a significant allocation of it in your portfolio.
And right, as you say, as the market continues to evolve, that sort of drifts down to those juniors, which, some of them have shown a little bit of sign of life, but as our friend Peter Grandin says, not near enough, and so you're looking for a more significant, not just sort of these 3-month play things, but as an investor, you sit and say, I'm going to give it a couple of years.
Sure, because look, typically, this is a lot of it is psychological. So what happened is, we've been talking about gold forever, Mike. And now look, if you look at the high quality, like an Anico Ego, it's had a monster run. Well, you know what? I mean, capital is going to get recycled. And if we believe gold, which, I think it's going to go, by the end of the cycle, at least up to 5,000. And people recognize the fact that price is going to stay, then capital is going to start to flow in to the juniors. And, I'm sorry, but we do get fever in this business, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so get ready for gold fever. That's all I'm saying.
Well, I'm going to keep talking on the fever theme, easy for me to say. I'm going to go back to tech for a second. I mean, here we are again, and you said at the Outlook conference, and you've been saying it, it's not that Johnny come lately there. You got to have your money not in Canada, but in U.S. stocks, in U.S. tech particularly. Well, that's had a hell of a run. Are you still on board with that? I mean, I was surprised by how deep the dip was, on the tariff announcement and how fast it rebounded. And we're basically at new highs across the board now.
Yeah, the pain trades due north, Mike. We missed the majority of what I'll call big money,
Mm-hmm.
because people people construe smart money with big money. The big money sold at the bottom again. We're going to play catch up. We're in a big AI trade. We're just in the very, very, very early stages of it. It's the only thing that's really holding up the private sector in terms of CapEx. And, we still think that we've got a long way to go. Mike, look, my view on the S&P is we're going to be somewhere north of 14,000 by the end of the decade.
Yeah.
So sure, we're going to have these fits and starts. With regard to April, I mean, it's reading President Trump's book, The Art of the Deal. I mean, he always is going to come in too high or too low, whether he's buying or selling. To me, the surprising part was how Wall Street took the head fake. Well, that's good. We know now who the emotional folks are. But what happens now, which is going to be very unique, not very interesting for investors, is you've got to understand. It's called bull market stress. The majority of the dumb money or the big money in Wall Street missed the trade. They're going to have to generate performance. Yeah. That means I would suggest for the back half of this year, it's going to get, small caps are flying right now. Small cap value is just taken off. So I would suggest, performance needs to be generated. And when people recognize the fact that President Trump's strategy, its big, beautiful bill, is supply side economics, it's going to stimulate economic growth and it's going to be non-inflationary, and that the Fed is going to bring rates down, this market is going to rally into the midterm elections, which is October 2026. So you better buckle up. You better have minimum amount of cash. And you've got to recognize the fact that, risk assets are the place to be right now.
And would you still lean heavily toward the U.S. and heavily toward tech and at the expense of Canada? I guess I'll put it that way.
Well, Mike, here's the interesting thing, right? So when we were talking at Wellington, we talked about the fact that Canada was going to get a nice bid if when Mark Carney got in, he moved back to the center, right? And it's very interesting. Let's just leave politics aside, right? Let's just assume he's not a liberal. Let's assume he didn't advise the previous administration. So let's just check our biases at the door. What Carney is doing, Prime Minister Carney is doing, is setting up Canada to become a resource superpower. And he's moved us back to the center. What he has done with policies, I mean, if you go and you dig into the NATO, the 5% NATO allocation, he can invest in icebreakers and critical minerals. Look, Mike, I think Churchill, Manitoba is going to be a tidewater port where we build 2 pipelines. Okay, and he's going to do that out of a matter of national security. They're going to double output of oil in Alberta, and it's going to go due south. I think the interesting thing politically, Mike, is unfortunately your province in Quebec is no longer going to hold the industrial policy of Canada hijacked. They're not going to hijack it anymore until BC deals with their politics. I'll just leave it like that. And Quebec deals with that. We're moving on. And when you can see, so Carney is, so the capital markets recognized this early on, and we got a nice rally. And I'm going to use an example. It's an easy trade or a traditional trade in global macro where you invest in an economy that is under socialist economic policies. And then once they get a whiff that there's a new sheriff in town and you're going to move back to capitalist views, you get a flow of capital coming in. Now, the rubber meets the road now. Prime Minister Carney's got to do a lot of heavy lifting right now. Yes. So I think Carney is setting Canada up. I know heads are going to explode out in the West. I know, but I'm paid to be objective. I think he's doing the best that he can do, given the lineage of the Trudeau agenda that he had to inherit. And I would say this, the move when I saw what he was doing with the NATO 5%, so Mike, 1.5% of GDP can be spent each year on critical minerals, on things, power, pipelines. within the 3.5%. He can build the icebreakers. We are going to become a superpower. Now, is it going to happen overnight? No. Right?
Yeah.
Do we have a play in technology? Not really. But, people have breathed a sigh of relief that Canada, at least for the moment, is starting to pivot away from the nightmare of the Trudeau decade back to the center. And I think the other thing when you look at it, it's also when you add the narrative of President Trump. When President Trump bombed Iran, what he did is he's moving, as an example, he's also moving back to the center from the extreme right. I mean, Steve Bannon and the MAGA crew went apoplectic, but you've got Carney and Trump moving back to the center. And what we have been talking about at Wellington is if you move back to the center, given where we are, that is a huge political area that could be very fruitful for the next 10 years. I think Carney's understood that. And I think President Trump has understood that. So I think North America is the place to be. So let me just add to that. And so would I prefer to be in the United States? Sure, on terms of the technology, but there are some wonderful, let's look at uranium. Let's think of, energy, pipelines, potash. We've got a lot of things, gold companies. So on a pick and choose basis, I think that the relief rally of buying Canada because Trudeau is gone and Carney's moving back to the center is probably gotten long in the tooth, right? So I would suggest that, I would prefer the United States, but I am not as reticent as I was previously to Canada. And let's be honest, Mike, when you have oil down year over year, it's really going to be tough for energy, specifically oil, even though I'm a big proponent of generating economic growth and a renaissance into Alberta and Saskatchewan. I mean, I think the other thing you have to look at, Mike, is the political power in Canada is going to finally move west. I think what's interesting, what's happening in Manitoba is just so Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta is very, very, very interesting. This is generational. I say to people, because I'm in Toronto, they go, "Oh, you're crazy." I go, I'm old enough to remember what happened when the FLQ started blowing up mailboxes in Montreal and how capital moved west. It's going to political power and economic growth is moving west. And I think the interesting thing, the subplot is Carney understands this. He might not want to say it explicitly out loud because his cabinet will go absolutely bonkers on him, but it's very interesting to see what he's doing.
Yeah, I mean, I also look at the repudiation of Trudeau tax era. I mean, that was steadily going up, whether it's individual taxation, obviously, obvious things like the carbon tax, but also the capital gains tax, which was, really, how could they have made the argument, which they did or tried to, that was good for the economy? And I mean, and now all of those same people did an about face. Mr. Carney wasn't there. I know he was advising from 220 on, and he must have been asked about that. But still, it's the about face that'll be, we've made some strides in a more positive tax regime. I still don't trust him, just so you know, Jim, seriously, I'm out west. And you're right. I think I did a comment to start the show saying that's their biggest problem, is I make a distinction between economics, politics, and business. And business is when you part with your own money. And I thought Enbridge was fascinating when they said, "Hey, we'll look at a new pipeline if you have legislative change." We're not taking your word for anything anymore. So I just think it's a fascinating thing, especially when you still got some of the players like Stephen Guilbeault, Chrystia Freeland. The list. I know. See, I can't mention her name without you laughing.
No, but I think I hear you. Bill C-69, and I hear
Yes.
and Smith. I think I mean the three premiers of the Western provinces, I think, are world class. I really, and so I really like what they're saying. And then what I would just say to you is, I think Carney is just ignoring them. And so it's one thing to be an advisor, and it's one thing to be the steerer of the ship.
Yeah.
And I hear you. You're absolutely right. I mean, trust but verify, right? And I completely understand that. But at the same point in time, you're looking for, well, how is he going to do it? And I think he's taken the page out of President Trump's page book, which is, it's a matter of national security.
Yeah.
So he's going to be able to do a lot of stuff through, I think, going through the NATO 5%. And he's going to be able to do it that way. And do you care how it's done? I guess is the question, as far as I'm concerned, right?
No, your point's well taken.
And so I look at it that way. And then look at the digital services tax, right? I mean, he's a pragmatic man. And what the other thing I would say to you is, look, he's Goldman Sachs. He worked, he moved Brookfield to Wall Street. He's a very smart man. He has exceptional experience. And I would just say, and I said this before, look, I lived in Washington, D.C. during the global financial crisis, during, 08. Yeah. And he was a superstar. He came in there and steadied the ship. So, yes, we have to basically measure twice and cut once. I completely agree with you, but I am pleasantly surprised. I would put it that way. And I think a lot of global capital is breathing a sigh of relief. And so in that sense, I would suggest to you that global capital has an open mind now to at least considering.
Yes.
Starting to think about, not writing the check and sending it in, but at least they're thinking about it and they're open-minded, as opposed to if we had the previous administration in, it would be a hard no. Yeah. So it's baby steps.
Well, one of the things I've said right from the get-go, I said the best thing going in Mr. Carney's favor is he's not Justin Trudeau, and he will be compared to Justin Trudeau, who economically, it's hard to describe politely. It's hard to describe politely his lack of sophistication. So anybody who came in and thought, raising taxes probably isn't how you attract capital, that kind of a superficial, accurate thought, though, was going to look good. So, yeah, I mean, but the other side is this. Let me make it clear. I want it to be true. Canada's coming from a deep hole. And, that's why I don't mind having a position in the oil sands, for example, or in oil and gas in this country, that we've come from undervalued, discounted Canadian dollar, operations that are efficient, they've reduced their emissions, et cetera. Well, the world may wake up to the fact that Canadian oil is awfully good and inexpensive, let alone our minerals, but we still have a ton of work to do.
We do, but I think I think there was some honest conversations, and let me just be in a when you go back 50,000 feet. Look, we should be one of the wealthiest countries in the world.
Absolutely.
Okay, and we've screwed it up. Okay, and so for 2 decades we put in a group of individuals that basically ignored private sector, ignored what our God-given endowment, our competitive advantage was. And I think the rest of the world saw the decline in our standard of living because of the misguided policies. Okay, so so where we are right now is we should be. You asked me about Canada. We should be the wealthiest country in the world, one of the wealthiest. And here's the other thing: we talk about AI. We should be building AI left, right, and center all over the place. What are you go look at what's happening in the Middle East. What are they doing? They're building all of these AI server farms, the AI industry. Well, we have cheap resources. We have cheap energy. And we have a cold climate. And we are within shouting distance of the largest market in the world. Can we get our head out of the sand and realize the opportunity that stands in front of us? And I honestly think, because I'm grasping at straws a lot of the time. But look, Doug Ford is happy. Doug Ford wants Alberta to get what they want, and they should. You know why? And back in the 80s, look, when Mulroney and Reagan were negotiating the free trade agreement, all the United States wanted was a secure deal with Canada over natural resources. And I suggest to you that we lost our way. We did not develop our resources. And the deal, because we were a branch plan economy, the deal was you develop your resources, we get a secure proportion of that. And if you want to make a couple of cars in Southern Ontario, God bless you.
Yeah.
Okay? We lost our way. We had mission creep. And the shot across the bow that President Trump and the Americans said to us is, get back your competitive advantage, which is natural resources. And so when Mr. Carney or Prime Minister Carney says, we're going to become a superpower, okay?
Yeah.
I take him at face value. The interesting thing is going to be how he does it.
Yeah.
Right. And so, with the NATO, this, and I think it's going to be very interesting. And sure, he has to threaten evil. And he's got the gang who couldn't shoot straight that's in his cabinet. Of course he does. But he's absolutely, let's give credit where he's a very smart man. Okay. So is President Trump. They're going to cut a deal.
Yeah.
I honestly am saying, so when you have the premier of Quebec going back to Quebec City and talking about his trip to DC, and they're asking, well, why are they putting 50% tariffs on our aluminum? They're not self-sufficient. And he's right. America only has 15%. They can only manufacture 15%. And Quebec does have a competitive advantage. He says boldface. It's about security. Right? The proportionality clause that was in the free trade agreement that Mulroney and Reagan negotiated, that had been in place, was not renewed the last time the free trade agreement was done. For whatever reasons, I have no idea. That is going to get done. We're going to focus on our core competency. As far as I'm concerned, Alberta's going to double output. So how are we going to finance? We're going to double the output of oil in Alberta. We're going to ship it to the United States. We're going to make a ton of money off that. Portion of it's going to go to Alberta. Portion's going to go to Ottawa. And that's going to fill our coffers. And we're going to get on with this. And we're going to become a resource superpower. So the long-term view for this country looks great. Okay? But we have a lot of wood to chop to get there.
Well, and you think about it. I mean, it's looked great 10 years ago, too, if you know what I mean. Like those advantages, as you just recall, have been there. We have refused to take advantage. I agree with you 100%. No country has blown their own prosperity as aggressively, has worked against their own prosperity. We have Stephen Guilbeault, still a minister, but he was at that point environment minister, boasting that we are the only country on earth to do these kind of restrictions and regulations on our oil industry. And I'm going, you don't get that's a bad thing, do you? So I mean, I'm in agree. I'm going to do the Missouri wait and see. I hope to heck they do it. We'll have lots of signposts along the way, with it. And all of it helped out with one big fat apology, to blowing that opportunity. But that's a Western view there. Look out. I think that would go a long way. But your point's well taken, especially back to individual investors. There's opportunity, in our resource sector. They're undervalued. The government is going to pump a ton of money in. They've already said it. But, as long as it goes into productive assets, as long as it goes effectively, and there's work to be done there efficiently, but the opportunity is there. And I agree completely with you.
We have no choice.
Yeah.
And I think the folks in Montreal and Toronto, and when I say Montreal, I'm going to be very, the power shift out of Eastern Canada to Western Canada is upon us. That's why I say to you, this is the 6 months where everything has changed.
Yeah.
Right. And so you're right. We've got to keep an open mind. But what I'm trying to say for investors is check your biases at the door.
Yeah,
because
I agree.
think we are living in historic times, and the forcing function for me is President Trump and his policies. and his no nonsense negotiation. And I think Prime Minister Carney understands what he's holding.
Mm-hmm.
And for him to do what he needs to do on the climate side, we need to become an economic power again. We need to be respected again.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, after the last 10 years, my personal opinion is we're not. He has gone a long way to doing that. And I would expect a deal cut. I go to New York all the time. I would expect a deal cut between the two countries. I honestly think that the economic integration between the two countries is going to get deeper. I also suggest that we are going to open up the Arctic. We are going to patrol the Arctic. That we are going to have icebreakers. Churchill, Manitoba will become the Tidewater port. I'm sorry, Mike. BC is going to be left behind until you guys straighten out your political nightmare. Okay?
Yep.
And we know you've got a lot of resources, but the point has come where the rubber has met the road and we have to change.
Yep.
And
Great.
we cannot put up with the shenanigans of people that don't understand that.
Well, my feeling was what we were always going to change. It was what pressure would come. President Trump's added one. Our financial situation is added two. And there's global things too. But I agree. I've always said, the war of political rhetoric versus economic reality and financial reality undefeated. So it's just how much pain we are going to go through to get there. And there's plenty of Canadians in pain with 2 million at food banks and, food insecurity so high, youth unemployment, all of these things. So I appreciate completely what you're saying. And I'd invite people to check you out every day at, on X, Dr. J Strategy. Dr. J Strategy, Wellington Altus. And of course, you can get his monthly review there too, or of what's going on in the world. James Thorne, as usual, what a delight. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Be safe.